Cloaked in a proud network uniform and effortless charm, Bob Crane deceived the American public for over a decade. Unsuspecting women stepping into his private hotel rooms firmly believed they were spending the evening with a wholesome television patriarch, entirely oblivious to the hidden Sony Portapak lenses rolling in the dark. That pristine facade violently collapsed on a sweltering June morning. Pushing open the door to Unit 132A, a colleague found a heavy pool of coagulated dark fluid obscuring his head on the mattress. With a black recording cord fashioned into a loose, mocking bow around his neck and his skull shattered by the heavy metallic legs of a camera tripod, the CBS superstar took his final breath surrounded by the very VHS tapes exposing his clandestine underground reality. Before the tragic, bizarre reality of Unit 132A came to light, his carefully curated public persona had been practically bulletproof. He was marketed as the quintessential family man, a safe and wholesome presence on the small screen. It was an era that demanded strict moral perfection and unwavering decency from its prominent entertainers. The American press adored him, frequently highlighting his pristine smile, tailored suits, and gentlemanly demeanor. Yet the camera tripod that ended his life was the central, structural pillar of his shadowy existence, a specialized tool facilitating a relentless pursuit of physical gratification far away from the television studios. Robert Edward Crane was born on July 13, 1928, in the industrial working-class city of Waterbury, Connecticut. His early years were defined not by a burning desire to act, but by a deep rhythmic passion for music. By the age of 11, he was already an accomplished drummer, developing a keen sense of timing and cadence. This fundamental musical foundation would later translate seamlessly into his impeccable, rapid-fire comedic delivery. His professional journey began in the fast-paced world of broadcasting, where he quickly proved to have a magnetic, resonant voice. He transitioned from a local rhythm maker to a charismatic radio disc jockey, eventually moving to the West Coast. Landing a prime spot at the prominent station KNX in Los Angeles, Crane found his true early calling. He revolutionized the morning broadcast format, blending quick-witted, spontaneous banter with high-profile celebrity interviews. His morning show became an absolute, undeniable staple for thousands of commuters across Southern California. At KNX, Crane routinely interviewed the biggest cinematic luminaries of the era, from Marilyn Monroe to Bob Hope. Instead of simply spinning records, he hosted a daily unscripted performance that captivated a massive, loyal audience. His charm was effortless and disarming, making listeners feel as though they were sharing a private joke with a close friend. This immense popularity and natural ease on the radio did not go unnoticed by ambitious television executives. They saw a handsome, articulate broadcaster who possessed an incredibly rare, authentic connection with the general public. The transition from the isolated sound booth to the glare of the television screen was gradual but strategic. Crane began with modest, unassuming guest appearances, carefully testing the waters of network broadcasting. He eventually secured recurring, stable roles on respected, family-oriented programs like The Donna Reed Show. These early parts helped solidify his burgeoning image as a dependable, well-mannered, and entirely unthreatening neighbor. He was exactly the kind of man Middle America trusted implicitly and welcomed into their homes. His television exposure increased significantly with a notable stint on The Dick Van Dyke Show, another pillar of classic broadcasting. In every single role, Crane projected a consistent aura of harmless sophistication and easygoing affability. He was being meticulously groomed by the rigid studio system to be the next major leading man of the network era. Behind the scenes, however, the immense psychological pressures of maintaining this pristine facade were already mounting. The contrast between the flawless man on the screen and the deeply flawed man in the shadows was beginning to widen. The absolute pivotal moment of his entire career arrived in 1965 with a daring new concept from the CBS network. The program was Hogan's Heroes, a situation comedy set within the bleak confines of a German prisoner of war camp. The premise was controversial at the time, attempting to extract lighthearted humor from a remarkably grim historical setting. Yet, the network desperately needed a lead actor who could anchor the risky show with undeniable commanding charisma. Bob Crane was ultimately chosen to step into the iconic leather jacket of Colonel Robert E. Hogan. As Colonel Hogan, Crane played the brilliant mastermind behind an elaborate, covert espionage operation hidden within the camp. His character was impossibly smooth, perpetually unfazed, and always at least one step ahead of his captors. Hogan used his weaponized charm and sharp wit to manipulate the bumbling camp personnel, turning their strict rules against them. The audience instantly and deeply connected with this confident, rebellious yet inherently patriotic figure. It was a complex role perfectly tailored to Crane's natural comedic strengths and authoritative presence. The show was a colossal immediate triumph that exceeded all network expectations. It ran for 6 successful seasons, producing a staggering total of 168 episodes. During its inaugural year, the program rocketed straight to the top 10 in national viewership ratings. The massive audience share translated into immense cultural and financial influence for the network and its star. Bob Crane himself received 2 Emmy Award nominations, firmly cementing his status as a legitimate television superstar. With the overwhelming success of Hogan's Heroes, Crane's public image reached an unprecedented level of widespread adoration. Prominent magazines plastered his smiling face on their covers, portraying him as the ultimate American patriarch and hero. He was the charming man every viewer wanted to invite into their living room for a Friday night broadcast. The studio's aggressive public relations machine worked tirelessly to ensure this wholesome narrative remained unblemished. They built a massive, impenetrable fortress around his reputation, projecting a reality that was fabricated. Analyzing this dynamic reveals a chilling, undeniable parallel between the fictional character and the real-life actor. On television, Colonel Hogan was a master deceiver, a man whose very survival depended on maintaining a complex, flawless facade. He manipulated his harsh environment and the people around him with a confident smile and a clever quip. Off the set, Bob Crane was executing an identical strategy, but with far higher, deeply personal stakes. He was maintaining an illusion of moral perfection while secretly concealing a life driven by insatiable private compulsions. The inherent danger of the Hollywood machine lies in its formidable ability to construct these flawless archetypes. When an industry demands absolute, unwavering purity from its stars, it inadvertently creates a perfect camouflage for deviant behavior. The perfect man shield that CBS built for Crane became his most effective, reliable tool for self-preservation. It insulated him from any meaningful scrutiny, allowing his hidden obsessions to flourish unchecked in the dark. The brighter the studio spotlight shone on his public persona, the deeper and more dangerous the shadows grew in his private world. This massive, unsustainable imbalance between image and reality is the central tragedy of his complex narrative. The public wholly trusted a character, and by extension, they granted unquestioning trust to the man portraying him. Crane leveraged this immense, unearned goodwill not to build a lasting artistic legacy, but to feed a growing, consuming darkness. The transition from a respected local radio host to a celebrated national television star provided him with unprecedented access and unchecked power. It was a formidable power he would soon quietly weaponize against the very people drawn to his magnetic fame. During the absolute peak years of the CBS broadcast, the underground life of the actor began to formalize and expand. The innocent, rhythmic charm of the Connecticut drummer was consumed by the enabling Hollywood ecosystem. He found himself surrounded by individuals willing to cater to his every whim, desperate to protect the lucrative asset he represented. The studio executives only cared about the weekly ratings, purposefully turning a blind eye to any quiet whispers of inappropriate conduct. This toxic environment of absolute enablement rapidly accelerated his descent into an organized system of clandestine activities. The sophisticated recording equipment found at the Scottsdale scene served as the mechanical culmination of a lifelong ingrained obsession with documenting his physical encounters. As early as the late 1950s, Crane had already begun compiling a secretive private visual library. What started with primitive single-exposure still photography gradually evolved alongside rapid advancements in consumer technology. By the time he was a household name, his collection of compromising images was already vast and meticulously cataloged. He treated these clandestine recordings as tangible trophies, indisputable proof of his conquests away from the bright studio lights. The camera was not just a passive observer, it was an active, essential participant in his private life. It granted him a twisted sense of permanent ownership over fleeting moments and unsuspecting, vulnerable individuals. The ultimate irony of his violent death is that the very technology he used to exert control became the direct instrument of his destruction. The mastermind manipulator of the small screen was finally outplayed in his own meticulously constructed, isolated darkroom. The tragic unraveling of this celebrated television icon was not a sudden, unpredictable collapse brought on by the pressures of sudden fame. The groundwork for his eventual destruction was established long before he ever donned the famous military jacket. His covert visual archive began taking shape in the mid-1950s, a period when he was merely a local broadcaster. It was during this relatively quiet era that a deep, unyielding psychological compulsion began to take permanent root in his mind. His eldest son would later confirm that the intense drive for constant physical gratification preceded his father's national stardom by a wide margin. This was not a fleeting phase or a temporary lapse in judgment fueled by the temptations of the entertainment industry. It was an organized, systematic pursuit that required immense dedication, secrecy, and a complete compartmentalization of his daily existence. The popular rumors that he documented thousands of intimate encounters are likely exaggerated, but the verified numbers still reach well into the hundreds. He was building an expansive, deeply private archive of his own transgressions, while simultaneously promoting a flawless, family-friendly public image. The sheer volume of his hidden collection reveals a man who was entirely consumed by a hunger that could never be permanently satisfied. In the early stages of this clandestine operation, he relied on the immediate gratification provided by standard Polaroid instant cameras. These devices offered the crucial element of rapid development, allowing him to bypass the risky process of commercial film processing. He would carefully stage the lighting in his private quarters, ensuring the final images met his specific exacting standards. The resulting photographs were not simply discarded after a cursory glance. They were meticulously preserved, categorized, and hidden away. These still frames served as tangible permanent trophies of his fleeting conquests, reducing the women involved to mere objects within a silent catalog. However, as consumer electronics began to rapidly evolve in the late 1960s, so too did the complexity of his dark hobby. The introduction of early portable video recording equipment, specifically the cumbersome Sony Portapak systems, fundamentally altered his approach. This new technology allowed him to capture not just a single frozen moment, but the entirety of an intimate encounter in moving detail. The transition from still photography to magnetic videotape represented a massive escalation in his need for absolute control and documentation. He was no longer just an amateur photographer. He was becoming the sole director, producer, and star of his own underground film empire. Analyzing this behavioral pattern through a psychological lens reveals a deeply ingrained obsession with dominance and perpetual ownership. The physical act itself often seems secondary to the structured process of successfully capturing the event on a permanent medium. By recording these encounters, he transformed vulnerable temporary interactions into permanent assets that he could review and control indefinitely. A chilling detail that underscores his methodical approach is his decision to undergo a surgical sterilization procedure in 1968. This deliberate medical intervention was designed to eliminate any potential long-term consequences, allowing him to pursue his targets without the risk of unwanted obligations. While the public continued to view him as the ultimate patriarch, he was quietly erasing the biological responsibilities associated with his reckless lifestyle. The central, unavoidable issue at the heart of his secret archive is the profound lack of genuine, informed, mutual agreement. While his defenders often argued that many of the women were willing participants in his recording sessions, historical police files paint a much darker picture. Numerous individuals later testified that they were unaware of the hidden lenses observing them from the shadows of his hotel rooms. They had walked into these private spaces believing they were engaging in a discreet encounter, oblivious to the permanent digital record being created. This stark discrepancy highlights a massive, deeply troubling imbalance of power that defined almost all of his interactions during this period. The immense weight of his television persona served as a blinding mechanism, disarming his targets and neutralizing their natural instincts for self-preservation. When a woman is invited into the private quarters of a beloved, universally trusted national hero, the standard boundaries of caution frequently dissolve. He weaponized the very trust that the American public had placed in him, using it as a specialized tool to lower defenses and manipulate situations to his advantage. The recordings were not collaborative projects, they were exploitative extractions, facilitated by the overwhelming influence of his celebrity status. To maintain and continuously upgrade this sophisticated visual library, the actor required a specialized accomplice who understood the emerging technology. This critical requirement led to the introduction of a man who would eventually become the dark shadow of his final years. John Henry Carpenter entered this isolated world through a casual introduction facilitated by another prominent actor on the television set. At the time of their meeting, Carpenter was employed as a regional sales manager for a major electronics corporation, specializing in the latest video equipment. This seemingly mundane professional background provided the exact technical expertise required to elevate the clandestine recording operation to a professional standard. The dynamic between the two men functioned strictly as a cold transactional arrangement. Both parties extracted exactly what they desired from the other. Carpenter provided the essential hardware, the heavy cameras, the necessary tripods, the expensive magnetic tapes, and the technical knowledge to operate them flawlessly. In direct exchange for this technological pipeline, the salesman was granted unprecedented, unrestricted access to a world he could never have entered alone. He was given a VIP pass into the exclusive guarded inner sanctums of Hollywood's elite social circles. More importantly, the actor actively allowed Carpenter to participate in or quietly observe the orchestrated intimate encounters they arranged together. To streamline their joint operations and deflect suspicion from curious onlookers, an effective, deceptive cover story was quickly established. The television star began introducing the electronic salesman to various women and industry insiders as his personal manager. This fabricated professional title provided a brilliant layer of legitimate camouflage, allowing them to travel, dine, and operate together without raising immediate alarms. The title granted the salesman an unearned aura of authority, making him appear as an essential protective figure in the star's daily entourage. Operating under this flawless disguise, the duo established an efficient, predatory routine that spanned across multiple cities and social venues. They would frequently descend upon popular nightclubs and upscale bars, utilizing the actor's overwhelming magnetic presence as the primary bait. Once a target was sufficiently charmed and isolated, the logistical machinery managed by the fake manager would quietly snap into place. They coordinated their movements with military precision, ensuring the recording environments were perfectly prepared before the trap was fully sprung. It was a calculated, synchronized operation designed to maximize their success rate while minimizing the risk of exposure. The salesman's dedication to this illicit enterprise was so profound that he frequently manipulated his own legitimate corporate travel schedules. He would meticulously align his regional sales routes to perfectly coincide with the actor's various promotional tours and theatrical engagements. This ensured that no matter where the television star traveled, his technical enabler and silent partner was never far behind. They became an inseparable unit in the shadows, a highly functional machine dedicated entirely to the pursuit and documentation of physical gratification. Their constant proximity further solidified the absolute necessity of the fabricated managerial relationship they presented to the outside world. When analyzing the core dynamics of this alliance, the term symbiotic feels dangerously inadequate. It was, in reality, a deeply parasitic ecosystem. The salesman survived the intense glowing radiation of the celebrity spotlight that his partner naturally generated. He fed off the social access, the heightened status, and the steady stream of vulnerable individuals drawn in by the allure of television fame. Without the protective shield of the actor's reputation, he would have remained an unremarkable, invisible corporate employee. He was a creature of the shadows who found a way to bask in the blinding glare of someone else's success. Conversely, the television icon relied on the salesman to continuously upgrade the mechanical infrastructure of his deep-seated psychological obsession. The actor needed the latest lenses, the clearest magnetic tapes, and the technical troubleshooting skills that only an industry insider could provide. He essentially outsourced the logistical burden of his compulsion to a man who was more than willing to manage the dark details. This mutually beneficial arrangement highlights a disturbing aspect of the entertainment industry during that specific historical era. It exposes a sprawling underground network of enablers who actively facilitated the moral decay of their high-profile clients in exchange for proximity to power. During the late 1960s and early 1970s, the cultural landscape of Los Angeles was undergoing a massive, fundamental shift regarding personal boundaries. The rigid moral codes of the previous decades were rapidly dissolving, replaced by an atmosphere of extreme permissiveness and unchecked hedonism. This chaotic environment provided the perfect, chaotic camouflage for an organized predatory system to operate unnoticed in plain sight. Behaviors that would have instantly destroyed a career a decade earlier were now often dismissed as mere eccentricities or standard industry perks. The duo exploited this cultural blind spot, operating their private recording studio right under the noses of network executives and a trusting public. The salesman did not create the dark impulses residing within the beloved television star. Those demons had been present for decades. However, he provided the critical tools, the logistical support, and the silent nodding approval necessary for those impulses to completely consume the man. He was the vital catalyst that transformed a disorganized private compulsion into an efficient, devastatingly effective machinery of exploitation. Their toxic partnership serves as a chilling case study in how unchecked access to technology can rapidly accelerate a psychological downward spiral. It demonstrates exactly what happens when a deeply flawed individual is handed the perfect tools to indulge their darkest, most hidden desires. His modus operandi was reliant on projecting an aura of gentlemanly sophistication and harmless intent. A typical approach would begin with polite conversation, an autograph, and a casual invitation for a seemingly innocent dinner. Once the target was isolated in his domain, the meticulously arranged technological traps were already lying in wait. The victims had absolutely no reason to suspect that the wholesome television patriarch was orchestrating a clandestine production. By the time the realization dawned, the manufactured illusion had already successfully served its dark, exploitative purpose. This systemic abuse of influence represents the absolute darkest application of Hollywood's manufactured star power. The industry deliberately creates these unblemished archetypes to sell advertising space and secure massive audience loyalty. However, when an individual with deep-seated psychological compulsions inherits that unearned trust, the results are devastatingly predictable. Crane understood exactly how the public perceived him, and he exploited that naive perception with surgical, chilling precision. The television network had unknowingly handed a master manipulator the ultimate master key to bypass standard social boundaries. However, the protective fortress of television stardom is notoriously fragile, built on shifting cultural sands and ratings data. By the dawn of the 1970s, the American cultural landscape was undergoing a massive, turbulent transformation. The network executives at CBS began to view their programming slate as hopelessly outdated and disconnected from younger urban demographics. This corporate realization triggered a notorious sweeping wave of cancellations commonly referred to within the industry as the rural purge. Programs that had dominated the ratings for years were suddenly and unceremoniously axed to make way for modern, socially relevant content. In the spring of 1971, the inevitable executioner's blade finally fell on Hogan's heroes. Despite maintaining a remarkably loyal viewership, the premise of a light-hearted prisoner of war camp was deemed obsolete for the new decade. The sudden termination of the series sent a massive, destabilizing shockwave through the actor's structured, comfortable existence. Practically overnight, the steady, lucrative income and the intense daily adulation of the studio lot simply vanished into thin air. He was suddenly an unemployed actor adrift in a rapidly evolving industry that no longer valued his specific brand of charm. The immediate aftermath of the cancellation exposed the severe, suffocating limitations of his acting range. He quickly discovered that he was suffering from a terminal case of industry typecasting, a common curse for iconic television leads. Casting directors and prominent filmmakers were unwilling to take a financial risk on a man so associated with a single comedic role. Whenever he auditioned for complex dramatic parts, the producers only saw the smirking, leather-jacketed colonel staring back at them. The very character that had catapulted him to unimaginable wealth and fame now served as the immovable anchor drowning his future prospects. Desperate to maintain his relevance and his lavish lifestyle, he eagerly accepted roles that contradicted his grim, hidden reality. He actively sought refuge in the aggressively wholesome, highly sanitized world of Walt Disney Productions. He secured leading roles in live-action family films like Superdad in 1973 and the sports comedy Gus in 1976. The sheer hypocrisy of this career move is staggering when viewed alongside his rapidly escalating underground recording operation. He was collecting paychecks for portraying bumbling, lovable fathers while simultaneously expanding a vast library of compromised visual material. These cinematic attempts to reinvent himself as a harmless family patriarch ultimately proved to be disastrous commercial failures. The audiences of the mid-1970s were growing increasingly cynical, and the forced, overly cheerful Disney formula felt disconnected from reality. His performances were widely criticized as wooden and lacking the effortless spark that had defined his earlier network television work. The absolute rejection by the movie-going public served as a harsh, undeniable confirmation of his fading cultural significance. He was rapidly transitioning from a bankable A-list celebrity to a forgotten relic of a bygone broadcasting era. In 1975, the television networks offered him one final desperate lifeline to salvage his crumbling broadcast career. He was granted his own sitcom, unimaginatively titled The Bob Crane Show, in a blatant attempt to recapture the old magic. The premise was severely flawed from the start, placing him in the role of a middle-aged man attempting to attend medical school. The writing was completely uninspired, relying on outdated tropes and failing to utilize his rapid-fire comedic timing. The viewing public responded with overwhelming apathy, and the network mercilessly pulled the plug after a remarkably short, embarrassing run. The professional collapse was immediately mirrored by a catastrophic disintegration of his personal and financial stability. His first marriage, which had miraculously survived the early years of his infidelity, finally buckled under the immense weight of his deceptions. The subsequent divorce proceedings were acrimonious and financially devastating. severely depleting his heavily mismanaged monetary reserves. He soon entered into a second marriage with his former television co-star, Sigrid Valdez. But this union was equally fraught with tension. The constant stress of a failing career and a chaotic private life created a deeply toxic, unsustainable domestic environment. Furthermore, he soon discovered that the financial advisors entrusted with managing his television fortune had been systematically draining his accounts. The massive syndication royalties and the lucrative endorsement deals from the golden years were squandered through gross incompetence and outright theft. He was a man accustomed to extreme luxury, suddenly facing the terrifying impending reality of total financial ruin. The crippling debt and the massive alimony obligations forced him to abandon his pride and accept any paying work available. This desperate need for liquid cash drove him directly into the unforgiving, exhausting world of the regional dinner theater circuit. For an actor who had once commanded top billing on national network television, the dinner theater industry was a humiliating demotion. He was trading pristine, state-of-the-art Hollywood sound stages for cramped, poorly lit platforms erected next to cheap buffet lines. The audiences were no longer the glittering elite of Los Angeles. They were distracted diners clinking silverware and conversing loudly during his monologues. He was reduced to endlessly touring the country, performing lightweight farcical plays in secondary and tertiary media markets. It was a grueling, soul-crushing schedule that required constant travel, cheap motels, and an endless cycle of forced, desperate smiles. However, from the darkest perspective of his deep-seated psychological compulsions, this grueling touring schedule offered a remarkably terrifying advantage. The dinner theater circuit essentially transformed into a vast, unmonitored hunting ground that shielded him from the Los Angeles paparazzi. Every single week presented a brand new city, a fresh anonymous hotel room, and a new population of unsuspecting targets. The lack of intense media scrutiny allowed his clandestine recording operations to operate with unprecedented, terrifying brazenness. The very professional exile that was slowly destroying his spirit was simultaneously providing the perfect environment to feed his darkest addictions. He was no longer constrained by the rigid moral clauses of major network contracts or the watchful eyes of prominent studio publicists. The regional touring life offered an intoxicating, dangerous level of anonymity that accelerated his downward spiral. His electronic salesman accomplice would frequently coordinate his own travel to perfectly intersect with these obscure theatrical engagements in various state capitals. Together they refined their predatory machinery, turning the depressing reality of the road into an efficient mobile production studio. The sheer volume of recordings produced during this bleak period dwarfed anything he had managed to compile during his network television days. The psychological toll of living this fractured, dual existence on the road eventually began to manifest in his outward behavior. Colleagues and stage managers frequently noted his increasingly erratic moods, sudden bursts of temper, and a pervasive, lingering exhaustion. The polished, effortless charm that had once defined him was slowly being replaced by a hollow, desperate mimicry of his former self. He was a man hollowed out by his own compulsions, desperately clinging to the fading embers of his celebrity status. When Colonel Hogan ceased to exist on the television screen, Bob Crane effectively lost the last remaining structural support of his sanity. The profound tragedy of his decline is rooted in the realization that his professional failure actually empowered his personal demons. Had he remained securely within the highly structured, monitored confines of the Hollywood studio system, the inevitable crash might have been delayed. Instead, the industry ruthlessly discarded him, unintentionally setting him loose across the country with a camera, a shattered ego, and insatiable appetites. He became a traveling merchant of his own fading fame, trading memories of a beloved television show for moments of illicit, documented gratification. The stage was now perfectly set for the violent, inevitable conclusion of a life built on shadows and deliberate deception. By the early months of 1978, a profound, undeniable psychological shift began to manifest within the exhausted actor. The grueling, endless reality of the regional theater circuit had finally stripped away the remaining illusions of his former television grandeur. Staring directly into the bleak void of his rapidly declining career, he experienced a rare, piercing moment of absolute personal clarity. He fundamentally recognized that his highly organized system of secret recordings was no longer a mere diversion, but a terminal sinking anchor. A desperate, almost frantic desire to reclaim control over his fractured existence slowly started to take a firm hold on his psyche. This sudden, powerful push for redemption was motivated by a deep longing to repair his thoroughly shattered domestic life. He initiated cautious, tentative efforts to reconcile with his estranged second wife, aiming to actively rebuild burned bridges with his children. To successfully execute this massive personal overhaul, he knew he had to systematically and ruthlessly dismantle his clandestine visual infrastructure. The very first, absolute, most crucial step was to sever the primary artery continuously supplying his dark, private habits. He had to and permanently cut off the electronics salesman who had reliably enabled his steep descent for nearly a decade. Disconnecting from a deeply entrenched, highly parasitic relationship is rarely a clean, peaceful, or mutually agreeable process. The actor began implementing a strict strategy of cold, deliberate avoidance, effectively shutting the operative out of his daily routine. He stopped returning urgent phone calls, abruptly canceled their joint travel arrangements, and explicitly denied him access to private dressing rooms. The fabricated, useful title of personal manager was silently but firmly revoked, stripping the salesman of his carefully constructed authoritative camouflage. The underlying message was unequivocally clear. The toxic partnership was permanently dissolved, and the shared enterprise was being permanently shuttered. For the technological enabler, this sudden, unceremonious exile represented a catastrophic existential threat to his entire acquired way of life. He was not merely losing a profitable business associate, he was violently losing his exclusive VIP access to Hollywood's glittering periphery. Without the protective magnetic aura of the renowned television star, he was instantly and forcefully reduced back to absolute social obscurity. The endless supply of vulnerable targets, the luxurious travel accommodations, and the intoxicating proximity to elite fame were entirely evaporating before his eyes. A deep toxic resentment inevitably began to pool within a man who felt entitled to the star's ongoing success. This boiling, volatile psychological tension finally erupted into plain view just days before the inevitable violent conclusion of the entire narrative. The two men engaged in a remarkably hostile, highly public confrontation inside the dimly lit confines of a local Arizona bar. Surrounding witnesses described a vicious, hushed argument filled with intense, barely contained hostility and definitive, unyielding ultimatums delivered by the actor. He made it unequivocally, brutally clear that he wanted no further contact whatsoever, demanding an absolute end to their decade-long association. It was a bold, necessary move for his personal recovery, but it tragically underestimated the venomous, unpredictable desperation of a discarded enabler. This sudden isolation effectively backed the enabler into a corner, creating a highly volatile scenario. The electronic salesman was directly facing the total destruction of his newly forged social identity and the removal of his primary gratification source. Individuals accustomed to operating securely in the shadows frequently react with extreme disproportionate aggression when their protective cover is threatened or forcibly removed. The actors had accumulated years of highly compromising visual evidence, and his sudden aggressive desire for a clean slate posed a massive logistical risk. If the star decided to expose their underground operation to clear his conscience, the enabler would face absolute, unmitigated legal ruin. Against this backdrop of severe psychological tension and looming threats, the final chapter unfolded in the sweltering, oppressive heat of Scottsdale. It was late June of 1978, and the actor was starring in a modest dinner theater production, ironically titled Beginner's Luck. He was residing in the unassuming, mildly depressing confines of the Winfield Apartments, a temporary housing setup utilized frequently for traveling performers. Despite the recent explosive argument and the clear boundaries set, the electronic salesman unexpectedly arrived in town, aggressively inserting himself back into the orbit. His uninvited, highly suspicious presence in the desert city cast a heavy, deeply ominous shadow over the final fleeting days of the actor's life. The specific dynamics between the two men during this brief final reunion were reportedly highly strained and deeply, fundamentally uncomfortable. The actor appeared visibly anxious and eager to maintain his newly established boundaries, yet seemingly lacked the forceful resolve to expel his former partner. They were observed dining together and navigating the local nightlife, projecting a thin, fragile veneer of their former celebrated camaraderie. However, the underlying power structure had irrevocably and permanently shifted, replaced by a suffocating atmosphere of mutual suspicion and unspoken, lingering threats. The seasoned predator and his discarded mechanic were sharing a final tense orbit before the inevitable catastrophic collision occurred. The evening of June 28th marked the final agonizing hours of relative normalcy before the meticulously planned, brutal strike was finally executed. Following a standard, routine evening performance at the Windmill Dinner Theater, the actor and the electronic salesman spent several hours together. Witnesses confirmed their presence at a local establishment, noting specifically that the interaction severely lacked the easy predatory rhythm of their past excursions. Sometime during the late hours of the night or the early quiet dawn, the two men finally parted ways for the absolute last time. The actor returned to the quiet isolation of Unit 132A, blissfully unaware that he had just concluded his final public appearance. Under the heavy, suffocating cover of profound darkness, a silent intruder smoothly bypassed the practically non-existent security of the Scottsdale apartment complex. The absolute glaring lack of any forced entry strongly suggests the perpetrator was someone familiar, someone who either possessed a key or was explicitly expected. The intended victim was asleep, vulnerable in the dark, and stripped of the charming practiced defenses he utilized in his waking hours. The attacker did not come armed with a conventional, easily traceable weapon, which points directly toward a specific, deeply symbolic choice of execution. They bypassed the standard kitchen knives, opting instead to utilize the heavy, solid metallic legs of a professional camera tripod. The specific selection of this blunt instrument fundamentally elevates the act from a mere physical elimination to a profound statement of psychological vengeance. Striking the fatal blows with the very equipment that defined their secret world was a calculated message, delivered in the most unforgiving manner imaginable. It was a terrifying physical manifestation of the dark, parasitic relationship turning and violently back on its original host. The specialized instrument of his private gratification was intentionally and maliciously transformed into the heavy hammer of his absolute destruction. The ensuing violence in the darkened bedroom was targeted, blindingly swift, and designed to obliterate the physical identity of the television icon. The perpetrator concentrated the devastating localized force on the head, crushing the skull and instantly ending the sleeping victim's life. This specific, brutal method of attack often indicates a deep-seated, intensely personal rage, showcasing a desperate urge to erase the person, not just silence them. Following the fatal strikes, the attacker meticulously arranged the physical scene to convey a personalized message. The electrical cord from the nearby recording monitor was carefully fashioned into a loose, mockingly decorative knot around the destroyed neck. The attacker then proceeded to calmly execute the secondary, equally crucial phase of their clandestine, organized, nocturnal operation. They ignored the scattered cash, the expensive personal jewelry, and the easily fenced valuables resting in plain sight throughout the modestly furnished apartment. Instead, they focused on the expansive, highly organized library of specialized magnetic tapes and sensitive photographic material housed in the room. A selective, meticulously chosen portion of the illicit video archive was systematically removed from the premises before the perpetrator eventually vanished. The intruder was surgically extracting the most compromising evidence, ensuring their own ultimate protection while simultaneously and permanently erasing their technological footprint. The unseen shadow slipped out of the apartment just as quietly and efficiently as they had entered, leaving the front door unlatched behind them. The sweltering, unforgiving Arizona night quickly swallowed the culprit, allowing them to fade seamlessly back into the obscure, untraceable anonymity they so deeply feared losing. Inside the silent, darkened bedroom, the meticulously constructed, guarded facade of the wholesome television hero had been violently and permanently dismantled. The final brutal act of this complex tragedy was not broadcast to millions of adoring fans on a brightly lit Hollywood soundstage. It was an utterly silent, completely solitary exit, orchestrated directly by the very demons he had actively invited into his hidden world. The immediate aftermath of the gruesome discovery rapidly exposed the severe underlying logistical weaknesses of the local authorities. The Scottsdale Police Department of 1978 was unequipped to handle a high-profile, complex celebrity fatality. They were a modest municipal force accustomed to standard property crimes and minor domestic disputes, not scrutinized national scandals. The jurisdiction did not even possess a dedicated major crimes division to immediately secure and process the delicate environment. This severe lack of advanced investigative infrastructure practically guaranteed that critical early mistakes would severely hinder the pursuit of justice. As a direct result of this systemic unpreparedness, the critical initial hours of the investigation were profoundly and irrevocably mishandled. First responders, local officials, and eventually curious onlookers trampled the unsecured perimeter of the darkened apartment. Crucial, sensitive forensic evidence was inevitably compromised, moved, or destroyed before specialized technicians could fully catalog the space. The physical layout of Unit 132A quickly devolved into an absolute forensic nightmare for the lead detectives assigned to the case. This initial chaotic failure would ultimately cast a massive permanent shadow over the entire subsequent legal process. Despite the degraded crime scene, the investigative focus almost immediately narrowed onto one specific logical target. John Henry Carpenter was rapidly identified as the absolute prime suspect by detectives analyzing the victim's recent interpersonal conflicts. The suspicion was not merely based on his verified physical presence in the city during the exact window of the lethal act. It was heavily rooted in a textbook psychological misstep that occurred just hours after the body was discovered. A seemingly innocuous phone call placed by the electronics salesman served as a massive, undeniable red flag for the authorities. When Carpenter dialed the local authorities regarding the incident, he hastily inquired about the status of the sensitive magnetic videotapes. He utterly failed to ask if his longtime associate had been injured, attacked, or involved in a fatal emergency. This profound deviation from standard human empathy is a classic behavioral indicator frequently observed in perpetrators of targeted violence. The caller inherently knew the grim condition of the victim, making his primary concern the secure retrieval of the compromising visual evidence. The authorities instantly recognized this psychological slip, placing the former manager squarely at the center of their crosshairs. The physical evidence quickly began to align with the behavioral suspicions developed by the lead detectives. Investigators obtained a warrant to thoroughly search the interior of the rental vehicle Carpenter utilized during his stay in Arizona. Deep within the fabric of the passenger compartment, forensic technicians discovered a microscopic, degraded speck of blood. Initial serological testing confirmed that the biological material precisely matched the type B blood profile belonging to the television star. This specific blood type is relatively rare, naturally occurring in approximately 10% of the general American population. However, the rigid technological limitations of the late 1970s severely handicapped the prosecution's ability to utilize this finding effectively. The revolutionary, highly definitive science of DNA profiling simply did not exist within the standard law enforcement toolkit of the era. The serological match was merely circumstantial, indicating a statistical probability rather than providing absolute, irrefutable biological certainty. The defense could easily argue that the sample belonged to any random individual within that 10% demographic bracket. Without the ability to conclusively link the microscopic speck directly to the victim, the physical evidence remained agonizingly inconclusive. The complete absence of the primary physical weapon further devastated the structural integrity of the local prosecution's case. The heavy metallic camera tripod used to deliver the fatal strikes was never recovered from the surrounding desert landscape. Furthermore, no credible eyewitnesses could place the electronics salesman inside or immediately outside the apartment complex during the critical early morning hours. Facing a circumstantial narrative supported only by an ambiguous biological match and a suspicious phone call, the local prosecutor hesitated. They ultimately made the deeply controversial decision to formally decline filing criminal charges. citing a lack of undeniable proof. The violent demise of a national television icon subsequently faded into a frustrating, seemingly permanent bureaucratic limbo. The file was quietly classified as inactive, leaving the grieving family and the shocked public devoid of legal closure. 14 long, silent years passed without a single significant development or a new piece of actionable evidence emerging. John Henry Carpenter moved back into the obscure shadows of civilian life, maintaining a steadfast, unyielding facade of complete innocence. The brutal reality of the Scottsdale apartment became a dark footnote in Hollywood history, obscured by the passage of time. The narrative experienced a sudden, unexpected resurrection in the early 1990s following relentless, sustained pressure from the victim's family. A newly appointed county prosecutor reviewed the dusty case files and decided to aggressively gamble on the existing, aging evidence. In 1992, the authorities formally arrested the electronics salesman and officially indicted him on first-degree felony charges. The legal maneuver was controversial, relying on reevaluating the exact same circumstantial chain constructed over a decade earlier. The justice system was finally preparing to drag the grim, parasitic relationship fully into the unforgiving light of a public courtroom. The publicized trial officially commenced in 1994, instantly transforming into a massive, scrutinized national media spectacle. The prosecution meticulously laid out the dark, predatory ecosystem the two men had operated, emphasizing the sudden, volatile fracture of their alliance. They presented the type B blood found in the rental vehicle as the definitive physical anchor linking the suspect directly to the violence. The jury was forced to confront the harsh, unvarnished reality of the television star's hidden life and the venomous nature of his closest associate. The courtroom essentially functioned as a post-mortem exposure of a highly sophisticated system of silent coercion and exploitation. However, the defense attorneys executed a brilliantly calculated surgical dismantling of the state's entirely circumstantial presentation. They relentlessly highlighted the severely botched 1978 crime scene, casting immense doubt on the fundamental integrity of all collected evidence. They aggressively emphasized the glaring, undeniable absence of the camera tripod and the complete lack of any corroborating eyewitness testimony. The defense successfully painted a picture of a desperate police department attempting to pin a high-profile failure on a convenient, easily targeted scapegoat. They demanded absolute certainty from the jury, leveraging the high legal standard of reasonable doubt to their maximum advantage. The jury deliberated for a remarkably brief period before delivering a devastating final blow to the prosecution's ambitious efforts. John Henry Carpenter was acquitted of all charges, silently walking out of the guarded courthouse as a legally innocent man. The rigid framework of the American justice system requires absolute, undeniable proof, a standard the state simply could not meet with 1970s forensics. The acquittal solidified the case's status as a permanent, unsolvable enigma, leaving the truth forever trapped behind procedural limitations. The suspected enabler took his closely guarded secrets directly to the grave when he passed away naturally in 1998. Yet the sprawling, complex narrative harbored one final, astonishing scientific revelation hidden deep within the archived evidence lockers. In 2016, modern forensic technicians finally applied advanced DNA sequencing technology to the preserved blood sample from the 1978 rental car. The definitive genetic results immediately sent a massive disruptive shockwave through the established historical record of the investigation. The extracted profile did not match the murdered television star in any capacity, severing the only physical link to the crime. The biological sample actually belonged to two different unidentified males, fundamentally obliterating the prosecution's central theory from 1994. This groundbreaking delayed discovery serves as a chilling indictment of relying on rudimentary, outdated scientific analysis. The primary piece of physical evidence that fueled a 14-year obsession and a massive public trial was proven to be a complete forensic illusion. It brutally exposed the severe, inherent dangers of attempting to force ambiguous data to fit a pre-constructed narrative of guilt. The 2016 revelation did not exonerate the enabler morally, but it permanently destroyed the legal mechanism used to pursue him. The absolute truth of the Scottsdale apartment drifted even further into the impenetrable fog of historical uncertainty. When evaluating the totality of this grim saga, the simplistic lens of a pure, unblemished victim must be discarded. Bob Crane was an intelligent, calculating individual who utilized his powerful protective television shield to orchestrate a vast system designed to serve his darkest impulses. The entertainment industry was complicit, deliberately manufacturing a flawless illusion and selling a false idol to millions of trusting viewers. This systemic enablement created the perfect insulated environment for a dangerous parasitic ecosystem to thrive unchecked. The heavy metal tripod, once the structural foundation of his clandestine recordings, ultimately functioned as the instrument of his physical destruction. The 1978 Scottsdale crime scene remains legally unresolved, permanently trapped by the forensic limitations of its era and the systemic mishandling by local authorities. The full reality of Bob Crane's final hours stays buried within Unit 132A, an enduring gridlock in the American judicial record.